Just tell us about Armored Warfare.
Yeah, so Armored Warfare is a strategic shooter. And I call it that because it's a game where it doesn't just come down to execution skills, how fast someone can aim, or if they can do a jumping headshot across the map. It is a shooter, but it is strategic in that a lot of things that come into play into achieving victory have to do with thinking about the map, thinking about situational awareness. Are you being flanked? Can you flank someone else? What is your position? What are the strengths and weaknesses of your vehicle versus other vehicles present in the match? So there's a lot of knowledge that goes into being a successful player, which I think really opens up interesting opportunities for players who enjoy the idea of competitive gameplay, but maybe are intimidated by the reflex expected for certain games to be able to compete.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this is just the super cool thing about Armored Warfare is just that it is modern vehicles. I think that's the I think any screenshot you see, and also that's probably the, I don't know, the feedback that we've gotten is so much from people, from the press and from fans, you know, playing it is just that it's just different in the sense of like you have the very large vehicles, they move really fast, and also that we have very different vehicles. You know, we have 4-wheeled vehicles, we have 8-wheeled vehicles, we have you know, and so it just gets a sense of it feels like you are on the modern battlefield.
There's obviously a lot of competition in the free-to-play market and the, let's say, tank game market. Yeah. What does separate Armored Warfare from the competition?
I think there's actually a lot of separation. It isn't just the fact that they're modern vehicles, but it's also what that means in terms of how you play the game. So with modern technology, you have higher accuracy, fast-moving vehicles, so you have these heavy machines moving around the battlefield very quickly. That's when it comes down to the core experience, is quite different from what you're going to find in other entries in the genre. On top of that, we brought in what we feel is one of the very important additions to the genre, and that is the idea of cooperative missions. So the fact that you can play cooperatively with players against AI vehicles really opens up the genre to players who maybe like the idea of tank combat but are intimidated by PvP or not interested necessarily in PvP competition. You know, on top of that, we've introduced things like player-owned bases and other features that help set the game apart. And I think they all cohesively come together to create quite a different experience other than what's already out there.
Obsidian is obviously known best from their RPGs, but how do you think that pedigree translates into game like
into Armored Warfare?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I think there's a lot of things about Armored Warfare that does link up. So a big part of role-playing games, it's not just story and characters. I mean, I don't know if they're the most important, but they probably are the most important. It's what differentiates and sort of a living world and things like that. But really what also it is deep systems. It's systems like, you know, combat systems and, you know, level up systems, progression systems, and these are all things that we've had to, you know, we've created, we've worked with, you know, other systems like Dungeons and Dragons, and so really that's what is the core to Armored Warfare as it relates to tanks going up tiers and things like that. On top of it, it's also the narrative. I mean, for us, really one of the important things that we want to add to Armored Warfare is taking like what we know about narrative and how we implement it into Armored Warfare.
What kind of plans do you have for the future of Armored Warfare?
So there's a lot of major features that we're working on internally to introduce to the players. I think probably, if I consider probably the biggest feature that's going to require a lot of work on our part, but it's something the players are really looking forward to, is a little bit more ranked competition. So end game content. So, and that actually I would say that's competition on two different levels. So that would be battalion versus battalion, you know, organized groups going into matches against each other so that they can have a contest of map tactics and awareness and skill. But also we really want to figure out and implement end game content for PvE as well. So that may involve very elaborate and immersive boss fights against powerful enemies. You know, we've talked about improving the overall campaign and narrative of PvE to connect it together and to add end game competition on that level. So you may not be playing against other players in the match, but you could be competing on things like clear times, scores, total number of kills, total amount of damage, and things like that. And players could earn rankings based on their performance in PvE as well. So we think there's a lot of interest in that. We're putting a lot of work into that internally to get that ready for our players.
As we touched on previously, it's big leap from, let's say, the traditional RPG.
Yeah.
But how was the transition for you as a studio?
You know, I think that what we ultimately with Armored Warfare is we wanted to make the game for a number of reasons. You know, and the first is how games get made and how people buy games obviously has changed a lot, and so we really felt a lot of it just for the studio's sake. We needed to look at doing a free-to-play game, and we pitched a lot of different ones, and this one sort of came to us, and so it was a great game to do. However, we would have only done it if we had people at the studio like Rich, who not only wanted to make the game but loves the genre and what I mean by genre, I mean MOBA games in general, multiplayer, deathmatch, and not deathmatch, just multiplayer,
team versus
team versus team, and PvP type stuff. And so, and that's really because we just get asked the question a lot, like how do you go from creating some super hardcore RPG, or like not Fallout New Vegas isn't that super hardcore, but a fairly hardcore RPG, to then a giant MMO tank game. Part of it is we all just love games and play games, but we just wouldn't have made it. We would not have made it if the team we didn't have a group of people that they felt that passionately about it.
Yeah. And how do you balance the fans' expectation for realism and the fun gameplay? Is the genre is it's so grounded in realism, but it should be fun as well.
So we really talk about that a lot. Actually, we have throughout the length of the project. Where do we draw that line? What aspects are realistic or not? And really, the way we handled it is we just made a lot of decisions early on what things we felt overall would enhance the game for players if we focus more on the realistic aspect, and what things would actually detract from it. If I was to point to a gameplay mechanic that isn't realistic but ultimately good for the game, you could think of things like hit points. Obviously, hit points don't exist. The idea that the vehicle runs 100% until that number crosses to 0, then it blows up. Not realistic. But when you try and make a competitive game where players are supposed to be able to make decisions moment to moment, the advantage that hit points provide is when you know how much damage your vehicle does and you see the hit points of your enemy, you can make decisions about, I can go around and trade shots with this enemy because I'll know I'll succeed, because I know my health, my hit points, his health, my damage, and his damage. So that gives the player opportunity to make choices. When you kind of take that away and you go a little bit more for realism, and it's kind of, well, we don't show hit points and there's a damage simulation that's hidden from the players, they don't really have opportunities to make those type of decisions in the match because it's really unknown to them what's going to happen every time they engage with another vehicle. So that's an example of not being realistic, ultimately more interesting game for the players. On the other hand, really important for us to make these vehicles as accurate and detailed as possible. So we've compiled a large library of books, expensive books, as Feargus will remind me frequently, full of references and details about these vehicles and the technology on them, and we model that as accurately as possible in the game. Anytime we notice something is not 100% accurate, we put it in the schedule to go and fix that vehicle to make sure we correct anything that we find. So that's really, and that really appeals to players who are looking to see these models, see these awesome-looking vehicles up close and accurately represented, and we're happy to deliver on that.
Yeah, and you'd be amazed. I mean, because even though there's often a lot of pictures of all these different vehicles, we always have the issue with what was the aperture of the camera, and was it the camera here, was the camera here, was the camera here, was the camera here, and so often as we're doing this, because we don't always have the opportunity to go actually take the pictures ourselves, it's often taking 500 pictures of the same, finding 500 pictures of the same,
if possible,
of the vehicle, if possible. Sometimes we can find 3, and then figuring out what actually is that vehicle, because we also run into the thing with the vehicles that what the published dimensions and horsepower and all that kind of stuff are not what we actually find is real in real. I mean, is what it is in reality.
Yeah, it's probably going to be a problem, especially in the newer vehicles.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's see. Are there any plans on now that the PvE and PvP are kind of separate? Are there any plans of putting them together somehow, making it a more cohesive experience for the player?
So I think one area where they will start to tie together that I would anticipate, and this is a ways down the line, is actually influencing the global story for Armored Warfare. So we would like to do events for the game where players will pick faction alignments, do missions for or against some of the fictional factions that we've created in the game, and have that outcome actually influence sort of how the story is changing. That might then in turn influence the next set of maps we make, because we want the maps to reflect what's going on in the world. So players would see that in PvP reflected as to what happened there. I think there's also room for combining the competitive element, as I mentioned before, looking for ways for players to compete in PvE and in PvP, and have those ratings feed back into an overall battalion rating, so that a group of players can compete to get the best ratings across the board in both modes. So I think there's a lot of room for new features and for us to explore on that front as well.
Now that it's kind of an ongoing service in development, what kind of plans do you have for release? Like when, or what will be the point that the game moves from open beta to release? Is there any kind of like set goal for that, or?
So there's no hard line. We have some goals internally. I'm going to avoid saying them because I don't want to get in trouble if we don't meet them. We do have a kind of a target of like, okay, once we put this and this in, then it'll be ready to call release. So there are some things. I mean, a couple things that are really important for us is end game competition, but also just a lot more vehicles, a lot more work on introducing more vehicles into the existing dealers. The current, because of just the schedule and the vehicles we made, there are some gaps in the progression that we would like to fill with the necessary vehicles.
Other nationalities.
Other nationalities, representing more countries around the world, very important to us. That's something we keep pushing for very heavily internally as well.
Finnish tanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. You know, so those are some of the things that I would expect to have in place before we actually kind of go, okay, now the game is moving out of open beta. I would anticipate it being next year, but beyond that, I don't have anything specific.